Today's big question, why do leaders who want more accountability often do things that create less of it?
I've been there, done that. Yeah. I've been there, done that. Yeah. I've been there, done that. And still learning.
Welcome back to Been There, Done That, and Still Learning. I'm Matt Marcotte.
And I'm Kevin Ertel.
Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Matt. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. It's always good to see your smiling face.
Same here. So today, Kev, we're talking about a word that gets thrown around constantly in organizations, which is accountability.
Mm-hmm.
We need more accountability. People need to be held accountable. We need better follow through. And whenever I hear that, I find myself wondering, are we sure accountability is actually the problem?
That's
What
a
do you
good thing to wonder. I wonder that too, And I think a lot of times what happens is when we're questioning whether we have the right accountability, we just add more accountability.
Totally.
Like, let's get another goal in there, or like we need more dashboards or
Yes.
more meetings. Definitely more meetings, And I think sometimes what ends up happening is we just create more reporting about the work instead of actually doing the work.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the interesting paradox and kind of how we just kicked off this session, which is I think leaders think they want their people to be more accountable, and the things they do to do that may actually be causing people to take less accountability and ownership.
Ironic, isn't it?
Ironic. Yep.
So, maybe the question isn't how do we hold people more accountable? Maybe it's more along the lines of what actually allows people to be more accountable.
There's an interesting
Deep,
pivot.
right?
Yes, very deep, right? And that is the conversation we're going to have today. I know, how strange, right? It's just,
weird.
we actually planned this. So let's do it. Okay. So Kevin, I'm going to put you in the hot seat.
Oh boy.
So
Okay.
a leader, I'm sure this has never happened. A leader comes to you and says, why aren't people taking more accountability?
Mm-hmm.
And usually, at least in my experience, it's never about them or their team. It's usually about someone else or someone else's team, right?
Always the others.
So it's all the others. So when someone has come to you and said, there needs to be more accountability, why aren't they taking more accountability? Like, what do you do?
Yeah. I mean, I started asking questions, honestly, because my first reaction is to kind of want to understand what's really happening. When they say that, when they just say someone's not accountable, it's not really that helpful. So what aren't they doing? Or are they missing deadlines? Are decisions not getting made?
Mm-hmm.
Are things falling down between functions? The others, that kind of thing. Are people waiting to be told what to do? I know you're going to have something to say about that.
No. What are you talking about?
And then, I start to talk about have we created the conditions for people to be accountable? And one of my favorite mantras, by the way, I talk about this all the time, is, you got to match the A's. You have to match accountability and authority.
Yeah, I love that.
If I'm accountable for an outcome, but I don't have the authority to make the decision necessary, we already have a problem, a big one,
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think that is such an important filter for leaders to use. Because as you said, if you have one and not the other, you're dead in the water. Or the person is dead in the water.
Bad both ways, by the way, if you only have one and not the other.
Exactly. I have authority, but no accountability. I've worked with those people too, actually.
They're dictators.
Yeah, exactly. It must be nice to be in those jobs. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, I think it's funny because I think to your point about me having something to say about this, I think leaders sometimes jump too quickly to the person, right? And what I mean by that is instead of saying like who's accountable, you kind of teed this up, which is asking, why isn't this actually happening?
Mm-hmm.
And so it takes it from being about like pointing the finger at like a person to understanding the context, the environment, the situation, which allows you to kind of, I guess, unpack it very differently, right? Because the things that you'll start to learn, the things you'll understand may actually create a clarity that you didn't expect, right? So maybe someone's working against 5 other priorities, or maybe there's 3 other functions that need to do something before I can do it. And every decision requires approval from somebody else. Like we've been in those situations too, right? And so if you actually don't understand why they're not able to actually be accountable or execute the way that you want them to, the way you diagnose and the way you coach or even the way you hold people accountable will potentially look very differently and may not be effective.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And you talked about a couple of things that I think are really important. That a lot of this times it is about like working with other people, right? And
Yeah.
if you think about initiatives,
Unfortunately, right.
yes, right, yeah, unless you have that all authority, no accountability thing.
Totally. Right.
Right. But, usually you have initiatives that are cross-functional. They're almost always cross-functional. And I do think I found good success in saying, like, we need somebody to be accountable for this whole thing and delivering the results on the whole thing. But I think where companies kind of get into trouble is when they give somebody that accountability without creating the conditions that allow them to deliver that, right?
Mhm.
Because that person is going to need something from marketing or tech or finance or whatever, all of the above. And those people all belong to their own functions, their own leaders, and their own priorities and responsibilities. So, like, how are we pulling this stuff together? And I think that's why accountability sometimes is two levels. There might be somebody who's accountable for a cross functional initiative. And I've had really good results on that when they're responsible for the work and delivering that cross functional initiative. But there are functional leaders that are part of that process that are accountable for delivering the results to that person, or working within that person's orchestration of the issues, understanding the dependencies, they're responsible for helping make sure all those kind of things happen, and for making sure that their function is strong in general. But these things have to work together. And I think the distinction around, where you're accountable or what you're accountable for and how groups of people have connecting, or complementary accountabilities is important to set up early and take advantage of that, because if you're just putting somebody's name on it, you're not magically going to create the conditions
Yeah.
you need for accountability.
100%. And then 6 months later, when it hasn't happened, right, we wanna
Or
say
sooner,
like, "What? What?"
or even sooner.
Or even sooner, exactly. I was giving them way too much time, I guess. So, like, 6 days later, when it hasn't happened, like, it's very easy to say, like, "Why didn't you take ownership?"
Yeah,
Right?
right,
Well,
right.
especially in the cross-functional moments. Now, that gets us to a word that I know you and I have debated, which is this word of ownership. So do you
Right.
wanna kinda give me what your
Yeah.
concern with that word can be?
Yeah, I don't mind the word. What I mind sometimes is how people interpret it. Because if people interpret ownership as like, "This is mine, all mine, get out of my sandbox," that's a problem.
Yes,
I think, but I
100%.
know you need it differently. But I think that's
Yeah,
that's where I just want to call that out briefly.
yeah.
Ownership doesn't give you a license to be a dictator.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and for me, I think that's where we use the word a little differently in this context, right? To me, ownership isn't territorialism, which I think is more what you're talking about.
Mhm.
It's almost the opposite. So for me, ownership, what it really means is I care about the outcome enough that I'm not gonna hide behind the boundaries of my role.
Yeah,
Right?
I
So if
love
I
that.
need your help, I'll ask for it. Like if I see a problem outside of my lane that's going to affect the result, I'll raise it. So if something isn't working, I don't get to say, well, I did my part, which I think sometimes accountability tells me what I'm answerable for, but ownership changes how I behave in trying to get there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's the distinction, right? I
That's
love
the
that
distinction.
distinction because
Exactly.
yeah, because accountable for an outcome doesn't mean that you personally do all the work either. But it does
Correct.
mean that you're the one pulling together to make sure it all does happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was just having this conversation with a team around you put things out there and then people wonder why it doesn't happen, but there wasn't quote unquote an operating system that actually
Right.
incorporated what accountability actually looked like, right? So it became very much open to interpretation how I held myself accountable or what I took ownership for or whatever. And so that clarity is really important. So I think maybe one of the first conclusions is before we diagnose an accountability problem, we have to make sure we haven't actually got a clarity problem, right? An authority problem, a capacity problem, a coordination problem, or frankly, a leadership problem.
Yes, yes, yes,
It
yes.
always comes back
Yeah,
to that for us, always.
I mean, it always does, but it should. Because I think that's right. Like as a leader, you have an accountability and a
Yeah,
responsibility, and that is to ensure that you have delivered on all those things you talked about first. That you've got clarity and that you've clarified authority and you've got capacity, coordination, et cetera. You have to do that before you can ask somebody else to be accountable underneath that work.
yeah, absolutely.
And I think this is where a lot of organizations can sometimes make it worse because if something falls off a little bit, what happens? Way too often? We got to have a meeting. We got to get into this thing. Something else slips. We need a new report. We need new status updates. Leadership needs more visibility. We need more checkpoints, and checkpoints can be good, but for what purpose? Are we
Yeah.
doing? And before you know it, people are spending just this enormous amount of time reporting on execution instead of actually executing.
I think, I mean, we laugh when you say that because it's so true. And it's this, I don't know if it's a human desire or a human need to, as like, create more control, to create more control mechanisms, let's just say, to
Mhm.
use your kind of firm of your framing. But I think there's a human consequence to that behavior too, right? And, the more tightly I control your work, the easier it becomes for you to hand ownership back to me, right? So if I tell you exactly what to do, exactly how to do it, exactly when to do it, and then constantly check whether you're doing it, who really owns that work?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, you do.
I do,
You do.
which I don't want to own anything. Listen, I want the authority and no accountability role, as we
Yes.
established earlier, right? So, you're executing my instructions, and now if it doesn't work, you have a perfectly legitimate defense, which is, I did what you told me to do.
Right. Right. Exactly. And, I don't think having checkpoints and those kind of things are bad. In fact, I'm a big believer in them, but it's about why you're having the checkpoint. Checkpoints should be set up in advance, by the way, not as reactions later. And they should be put there so that you're moving the work forward. Where do we have obstacles to clear? Or if we're a little bit off plan, how are we fixing it? What are these key points that we're going to make sure that we're keeping things moving along? Where are key decisions going to be needed to be made, and have we planned for that ahead of time? What help do we need? That sort of thing. But that's very different from we're going to drop in all these checkpoints so that you can prove to me that you're doing the job.
It's super important. And I think that is the critical distinction, right? It's that idea, are we creating visibility so we can help people succeed? Or are we creating visibility so we can catch people failing? And I think those, depending on which way you actually go, those create very different behaviors.
Yeah, and if you think every checkpoint is going to become a blame session, you're going to you're going to provide less information, not more, and people are going to just not surface problems. My friend Mike Africa calls it green masking, where you're just going to say everything's great, peachy keen, we're doing well. So people will wait and they'll protect themselves until they can sort of make sure they have an explanation that shows it wasn't their fault.
Green green masking, is that what it's
Green
called?
masking, isn't that a
I
great concept?
I love that. Everything's wonderful, right? But and I think to your point, to that point, leaders then get these behaviors that they don't want, right? And so what you just said, and then I also love, then people start to literally like CC everyone on emails, right? It's like the CYA strategy, right? Everyone is CC'd so that there's always someone else that they can point to. They escalate every decision, right? They don't take that kind of ownership. They just like, they wait for for permission for people to tell them it's okay to do things, right? And they document everything. So when the leader says, why won't anybody take ownership? It's, well, because, like your point about like this idea of like the behavior change, you've just made ownership dangerous.
Ooh, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, scary.
Yeah.
Ownership's scary.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but it's true, because like you can't say you want people to act like owners and then punish them every time they exercise reasonable judgment and it doesn't work out perfectly.
Right. They call that negative incentives, I think.
Is that what they call it? Yeah.
Yeah, that would be bad.
Yeah. That would
So
be bad. Yeah.
let's not just focus on the negative. Let's flip it around.
All right. Flip it and reverse it.
Yes. So if more oversight isn't the answer, and I think
Mhm.
we agree it is not, what does actually make somebody step up and take ownership?
Yeah, great. You know what, Kevin? Great question. I I think a big part of it, honestly, is understanding what we're actually trying to accomplish, right? Not just here's your task, but here's where we're going, here's why it matters, here's what we're trying to make true. Because I think once people understand the outcome, right, this North Star that you and I have talked about so many times in so many episodes, that actually helps them to understand the judgment they should exercise, right? So if all you've given me is the task, then the job is to complete the task.
If they complete exactly what they're asked to do and the outcome still fails, then they can just say, well, I did my part.
Exactly. I did my little part and the rest of it was up to somebody else, which is one understandable depending on how you're framing, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's the difference for me, and I talk a lot about this with executives and teams, is the difference between an employee mindset and an owner mindset, right? The employee says, like, "I completed my task," like we just said, right? Where the owner asks, "Did it work in service of the larger kind of what we were trying to solve for?"
Yeah, and I think a good way to get to that is something I talk about all the time, which is co-creation.
Yeah, I love this.
So, like, you can't bring somebody in way after the fact and just tell them, "You own it now." This is it's yours, you take it.
Here you go, hot potato.
Yeah, so bring them in early, bring them in and have them
Mhm.
help create it. First of all, you're gonna get better product in the end anyways, especially if it's someone who's gonna be more involved with implementation, they're gonna help you validate it and make it better, but, they're closer to the customer, they're closer to the process, they're closer to the potential obstacles, so they can help you figure out what it is you're trying to do better to begin with, but then
Mhm.
that just leads right into their much easier way for them to own the outcome and own the process.
100%. I mean, people support what they help create. Right?
Yeah.
That's just a fundamental truth about human behavior, right? And it doesn't mean that everybody gets their way, which I think, you talk about a lot, right? And you'll talk about a
Mhm.
little bit later, I'm sure, as well. But it means there's a psychological difference between being handed somebody else's answer and having some agency in creating the answer. And it helps shift people from your plan to our plan.
Yes, and that's important, and by the way, there is a psychological principle called procedural justice that says people can get more behind it as long as they know they were heard and their
That's
thoughts
right.
were there,
And I think
and
I don't think we can ever overstate that believe that because that is fundamental to everything we talk about.
it absolutely is, and it leads to another thing we always talk about, which is what you really need for ownership, and that's commitment.
Mhm.
People gotta lock in, and commitment is a different mindset that gets you to ownership and accountability. And you don't have to agree with every single decision to be committed, right? But you sort of have to stop saying, "Can this work?" and get to a point where you start saying, "How can we make this work?" And I have this principle I always like to use. I call it get 70% aligned and 100% committed. Meaning, you might not be 100% aligned, but you're like a 7 out of 10,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And if you're there, you're mostly there. And now it's time to flip it and go, I'm going to commit. Because once you commit, now you've shifted your mindset.
And I think this is one of those concepts that I think some people, many people, I'm not sure, I haven't done any research on the total number, but I've seen this in my career, my experience. They have a hard time with that because there's a belief that everyone has to agree fully to move forward. And as you say, that's not true, right? I love the distinction because commitment doesn't require agreement, right?
It
And
doesn't.
as a person, as a leader, as a participant, as a team member, I can disagree with the decision, yet still own my responsibility for making the decision we've made successful. And I think that actually may be one of the biggest tests of ownership. It's easy to own the decision when it's your idea, right? We all could do that. But what do you do when it wasn't?
At some point, you gotta, like, lock shoulders and roll in with the team, right? I mean, here's the thing too. You're never gonna get everybody to be 100%
No.
agreeing on something because you're talking about the future. We None of us know the future. We don't know that for sure. So, but at some point, we have to, like, take charge of creating the future
Yes.
versus debating the future, which is, I think, where you're getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think leaders have such a responsibility here to do exactly what we're talking about, right? So we love to say, and we started the episode with this, I need people to take more accountability or more ownership. But in my way of thinking, ownership isn't something that you demand from people, right? Like it's a leader's job is to create the environment and the conditions where ownership is more likely, right? So do you understand where we're going? Do you understand the choices we've made? Do you have the information and capabilities to contribute? Do you have the room to exercise judgment? Do you believe your contribution actually matters? That's leadership.
Yes, yes. And things I talk about on the execution side too. Do you have the capacity?
Yeah.
Are the dependencies clear? Do you know who owes what to whom?
Mm,
Do you feel like you can make all the decisions you need to make? Do you have the authority? Where are we looking for opportunities to identify obstacles early? All those kind of things that you want to check ahead of time because now you're creating those conditions.
And I love that you just said ahead of time because I think this to me is kind of a important point that we're coming back to, or coming to, I should say. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. That accountability is
Mhm.
important, but it's not the starting point.
Right.
It's all the things that we just talked about that lead up to an environment where we can then hold people accountable or create accountability.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's another distinction I think that matters here. And, I read about this in my book, which is commitment beats compliance. So you mentioned commitment earlier. And I think compliance asks, what am I supposed to do? And commitment asks, what are we trying to accomplish? Right? If you actually
Yes.
have a committed team versus a compliant team. And those may sound similar, but they're not.
No, I mean, and compliance can kind of sort of feel and look like accountability for a
Yeah.
while. People are hitting their deadlines. They're attending all those meetings you schedule. They're
Mhm.
updating the dashboard. They're doing what they're supposed to do as you've laid
Yeah.
it out.
Yeah. And I think there's a huge piece of this that is a reality that you and I have seen in our careers and advise other people on, which is nothing's static, right? Things are always changing. When reality changes, like the customer responds differently, a deadline moves, something we assume turns out not to be true. There's no instruction sheet for every situation. So
Does
now
that
you
happen?
actually, what?
Does that happen?
I mean, once in a small while, but every once in a while, right? But there's no instruction sheet for that every situation, right? So you have to think like if you've trained people to comply, they're going to come back and just ask you, what do you want me to do now? Right? Because every obstacle becomes an excuse for a full stop. Right. But if you create like commitment through ownership and through clarity, they're more likely to come back and say, like, here's what I think we should do given our new reality.
Yes. And that's a very different organization, right?
Completely different, right? Says one requires, I guess, leaders to constantly provide answers, and the other creates people capable of bringing answers. And I think that is the kind of holy grail, right? To get an organization where they're doing the work. Because let's face it, the collective intelligence is far, far more powerful than the lone wolf who thinks they have all the answers.
Exactly. I mean, you are very, very smart. So maybe you're the exception to the rule,
Well,
but
that was a good setup. Well done.
all right. So let's switch and make this practical.
Okay.
Someone listening really does have an initiative struggling. Where should they start?
Okay. So I would resist the urge to ask who's accountable and then instead ask what's actually getting in the way.
Yes, yes, yes. I agree with that. And I'd take like one struggling initiative and say, is the outcome actually clear? Do people
Mhm.
understand why it matters? What's the context? Do they have the capacity to deliver it? Are the dependencies clear? Does the person who's accountable have the authority they need? Where are decisions getting stuck? When you sort of ask those kind of questions, you might discover very quickly what looked like an accountability problem really is something else entirely.
I love that. And to build on that, this idea of asking different questions to seek understanding, meaning their understanding, right? So instead of did you do it, ask what outcome were you trying to create, right? Or why isn't it finished could become what's getting in the way, or who dropped the ball could be well, that one we should keep. No, what did we learn, right? And so one of my favorites, instead of what do you need me to decide, asking what do you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, that's an important one because now I'm asking you to think before you escalate it to me.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to listen to the answer.
Right. That's key.
Yeah, because eventually, if we don't do that with a genuine willingness to be altered by what we hear, as you were saying earlier about kind of people's behavior change, they're going to stop recommending.
Yeah. Yeah. And that doesn't mean you have to always agree with the recommendation, at least the way it came out, but that's where you start to ask questions instead of just like disagreeing with it right out of the gate.
Yeah,
How does that get us to the outcome we discussed together? What are the risks? What dependencies have you considered in order to deliver on that?
yeah, yeah.
What one of my favorites, what would have to be true for that to work?
I love that.
Yeah, because like what happens then is now, you're sort of coaching instead of directing and you're helping the team get to the answer and that's such a better way to go and you'll end up with better results for sure.
Totally. I think another question, since we're since we're on the these are all the questions you can ask bandwagon, and I love this one, which is, what would you do differently if it was your business? I think that
Yeah.
immediately moves people from employee mindset to owner mindset
Yep.
and puts more skin in the game where they can't just be like, well, I did my part, because if it's your business, you're every part.
Yep.
Right. And so to get people to start thinking in terms of that creates more personalization in a good way. And I think surfaces potentially different creative solutions to whatever it is you're trying to get them to be part of.
Yeah, it's mindset, right? You're shifting mindsets, and that's the whole point, right? So, and I think as we sort of wrap it up, I would say that we're not saying accountability doesn't matter. Accountability absolutely matters,
Absolutely
right?
matters. Yes.
Commitments matter, deadlines matter, results matter. Um, if you repeatedly commit to something and don't deliver, that's a problem.
Hmm. And I think, like you were saying, just to put a very fine exclamation point on that, this is not an argument against accountability. If anything, I think it's an argument for much more demanding kind of accountability,
Yeah,
right?
more realistic accountability too, right?
Yeah. Well, accountability as a part of the process, it's like it's not the it's not the answer, it's part of the process of making things happen. And
Yeah.
one that people either don't put in place, make assumptions people know what their accountability is, or haven't, as you were saying before, created the clarity to understand what that actually means for the person.
Yeah, if you're gonna ask accountability somebody, you still have the responsibility to create the conditions for them to succeed with that accountability.
So maybe there's an irony in all of this, right? So if you want more accountability,
Yeah, stop starting with accountability.
get that, people, write that down. If you want more accountability stuff, start with accountability and start asking what might be preventing it, right? So here's a question we would leave you with. So think about a place in your organization where you're the most frustrated by the lack of accountability. I guarantee it's probably on someone else's team. Um, but before you ask who isn't delivering, ask what might be getting in the way of them delivering.
Right. Is it clarity, capacity, authority, coordination, decision? I know I keep saying the same thing over and over, but these things really matter and you have to really be thinking about them.
That's right. That's right. And I would add one more. One more. So have we created an environment where people actually feel able and expected to own the outcome?
Yes.
Because if the answer is no, as we were saying at the beginning, another dashboard just ain't gonna fix it.
Right. Yeah. Create that mindset, put the conditions there, and then, magic will occur.
All right. Now, Kevin, I feel like in most episodes, you get to tee us up to what we're still learning. But today, I'm going to take accountability for that part of our episode. So
Well done. I feel like I did lay out the conditions for you to take accountability, and you did well
you
with
did.
that.
Thank you for without even knowing you were doing it. So
Yes.
I just took ownership of the whole thing. So, Kevin, what are you learning this week?
All right. So I learned something kind of crazy this week. It's called the cheerleader effect. Wait till you hear this.
I love it
Now,
already.
this is a fairly newly formed cognitive bias that scientists come up with. They have all these different biases, right? The
Okay.
psychologists come up with. Here's the crazy thing. This one started on an episode of How I Met Your Mother.
Okay, first of all, the research alone tells me that's valid. So,
It's amazing. So they had an episode where Barney on that show was like explaining this thing where like if you see a group of women together, they're all look really attractive, but if you look at them individually, not so much. And there's like a whole thing about
oh,
it
Barney.
got really crazy on the TV show. But that actually like inspired scientists to figure out if that's really true. And they found out it is. People are actually more attractive in a group of attractive people or a group of people, period, than they are individually. It's how I feel like when I'm on this podcast with you, I'm slightly more attractive because I'm there with you.
I see what you did there. I was gonna agree with the point regardless, but now I totally agree that that's so that's there's actually like research around this
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? And it started with a sitcom.
with an episode of How I Met Your Mother. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a good one. That's a good one. All right, mine's a little different than that, but I did talk about someone trying to make me feel beautiful. I did get an email last week, and maybe you've gotten these, but it was essentially from a vendor, someone who wanted to sell me some service around amplification of my book. Right. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yes, get them every day.
And so essentially, it's a very long email, and it's about when I was reading Built on Belief. Here's what I noticed, and then all these things. So where I'm going with this, as far
Oh,
as
yeah.
what the email looks like.
Yep.
And I was just reading it, and of course, inevitably, there's a mistake. There's a conclusion or a fact that they stitched together that wasn't actually true.
Right.
Right. And so I was like, interesting. And so what I realized was that, or my feeling of this is that AI is trying to make specificity the new authenticity.
Oh.
So they're trying to send you these things that somehow this person read the book, had opinions about it, wants to connect with me, that he has done the work to look at my body of work and spend the time. And clearly he has not, right? Yeah, you've had this experience.
Oh yes, for sure. I love when they start with, I just finished reading your book, and then they
Mhm.
immediately say something that was not
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. And so I think the interesting thing to kind of, as we think about AI as a continually evolving, but also a tool that we are more and more leaning on, it's getting extraordinarily good at creating the appearance of thoughtfulness, right? It can make it
Mm.
sound like we read or researched or cared or listened when we didn't, right? But this is the warning, right? So I feel like if AI is manufacturing experiences that they never had or the person never had, right? Then it's not using technology to enhance the human experience. It's using it to counterfeit it.
Ooh, right.
And my belief, my learning, my reinforcement was you cannot outsource authenticity,
Yeah.
because the backlash is exponentially worse than if you just said, "I'd like to read your book. I haven't had time."
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because it's just a big giant lie
It's
otherwise.
a lie. And the
Yeah.
funny thing was I didn't respond to it. First I was gonna be like, "And another thing." And I was like, "It's not worth it." And then the
Yeah.
person sent me another one. I'm sure the same thing happened to you. And they just kept building on this. And I'm
Oh,
like,
yeah. Yep.
"Oh my God. Check your work. Read the room, buddy."
It's easy to be relentless too when a computer's just doing it for you. You don't have to
Totally.
put any
But it was
work
making
into it.
it worse. I mean, I would never even consider engaging with this company because
Yeah.
of that.
Yep. Same. I get those every day. Ugh. All right, Matt. Those are some good learnings. We had some fascinating
Fascinating.
experiences
You bet.
together, and this has been great. I really appreciate spending the time with you,
Always.
and everyone sticking to it till the end with us. And thank you all for joining us on Been There, Done That, and Still Learning.
See you next time.
I've been there, done that. I've been there, done that. I've been there, done that. And still